Good evening, everyone. Warmly welcome to this LawTransform webinar, where we will discuss Adrian Jjuuko's book on strategic litigation and the struggle for lesbian, gay, and bisexual equality in Africa. My name is Siri Gloppen. I'm professor of comparative politics at the University of Bergen in Norway and director of LawTransform. LawTransform, or the Center on Law and Social Transformation, is a global research center based in Bergen, where it is established as a collaboration between the Christian Michelsen Institute and the University of Bergen. Through international interdisciplinary research collaboration, teaching and dialogues such as the one we'll have today, LawTransform aims to understand how rights and law are used as tools for social change and to what effect. And the panelists that you'll meet today are all long-term LawTransform affiliates and collaborators. But before introducing them, I will say a little bit more about the book that we'll be discussing today. Strategic Litigation and the Struggle for Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Equality is the starting point for the book is a global phenomenon, namely the rise in the use of litigation to advance equality for lesbian, gay, and bisexual persons. In Africa, this takes place against the backdrop of massive homophobia. And in the past 2 decades, 30 strategic cases have been filed by LGBT activists in Botswana, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and Uganda. Many have been successful in court, but have not resulted in significant change on the ground. On the contrary, court victories often seem to have caused a backlash, counter-mobilisation, violence against LGBT persons, and in some cases, further criminalisation of same-sex relations and constitutional prohibitions on same-sex marriage. This is the puzzle at the core of the book. And you will hear more about this from Adrian shortly. The book was published as part of a LawTransform project, Political Determinants of Sexual and Reproductive Health, Criminalisation, Health Impacts, and Game Changers. And if you want to read it, and of course you should, it's free to download from the LawTransform website. I'm very, very pleased and honored to introduce today's panel, which truly is exceptional. Adrian Jjuuko, the author, is the Ugandan human rights lawyer and advocate. He holds a doctorate in law from the University of Pretoria. And the book is based on his doctorate from the University of Pretoria, but also on his long experience with litigating and advocating human rights and rights of LGBT people. He is the founder of an executive director of Human Rights Awareness and Promotion Forum in Uganda, where he coordinates strategic litigation efforts on LGBT rights and was instrumental in the successful prosecution of the case that led to the nullification of Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act in 2014. Frans Viljoen is director of the Center for Human Rights at the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria. He is also the academic coordinator of the LLM, or Master in Law, on Human Rights and Democratization in Africa, which is presented by the Center in collaboration with 11 partner law faculties across Africa. And actually, several of the panelists today are graduates from that program. Frans has published numerous articles dealing with international human rights law and the book International Human Rights Law in Africa at Oxford University Press. Tom Keck is the Michael O. Soyle Chair of Constitutional Law and Politics and Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs in the US. He is currently leading a large-scale collaborative project funded by Carnegie and the US National Science Foundation on the political beneficiaries of free expression jurisprudence worldwide. Ayodele Sogunro, or Ayo, is a Nigerian writer, social entrepreneur and lawyer. He has years of field and courtroom experience in law and advocacy. His most recent focus is on the protection of sexual minorities in Nigeria and Africa. And his literary essay, One More Bound in Freedom, Themes from the Nigerian Anti-Gay Law, was shortlisted for the 2016 Gerald Kroc Award for African Writing. Ayo holds a master's degree in human rights and democratization from the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria, and is currently about to finish his doctoral research in sexual and reproductive rights at the University of Pretoria. Satang Nabaneh is a legal scholar and consultant with more than 10 years of experience. She holds a doctoral degree from the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria, where she researched and managed various research projects on human rights, gender, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. Satang is also the founder and editor of Law Hub Gambia, a repository of consolidated legal resources on the Gambia. So, as you understand, this is quite an impressive panel. Welcome all, and thank you for being with us today. I want to give the word to Adrian Jjuuko to introduce us to the book. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Siri, and thank you, participants. Welcome to the launch. I'm speaking to you from Naivasha in Kenya, where we've been discussing exactly what we're discussing now. I had a presentation in the morning about strategic litigation on LGBT rights and how it leads to social change, and I discussed most of what I'm going to say here. What is unique about this is that perhaps it would have been possible for me to launch this book in Uganda, because right now, this only copy that I have here is the only copy that I have. The copies that were being sent to me were, Uganda would say, were arrested by the Minister of Ethics and Integrity. So he's keeping my property, 10 copies of the book for censorship. I don't know, he hasn't given a decision yet, but he thinks this is promotion of homosexuality. So that's how bad things can get sometimes. But I want us to discuss my findings. This is part of my AOD thesis. And for this thesis, I studied a number of countries. I studied Botswana, I studied Kenya, I studied Uganda, I studied South Africa, I studied Nigeria, I studied the US, I studied Canada, India, Nepal, and Belize. So I had a number of countries to compare, both in and outside of Africa. But the focus was on common law African countries and how strategic litigation has actually led to social change in Africa. Just like Siri said, the first finding is that, hey, we are doing a lot of strategic litigation right now. Not before. We seem to have started doing strategic litigation in the past 20 years. And the past 20 years, that was mainly South Africa. For most of us, I think Uganda opened the way in 2007. It's about 12 years ago. That's when we started doing active strategic litigation. We are now at more than 20 cases outside of South Africa. That means that increasingly strategic litigation is something that is popular. People are using it. They're finding it as an avenue that you can use to create social change for LGBT rights. And then, interestingly, these cases have been successful. So you have many of these cases being successful in court, including the case in Uganda, which led to the nullification of Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act. This success kind of makes you go forward. It encourages you to proceed. At the same time, we have to be careful. Not all countries in common law Africa are doing litigation. There are about 6 or 7 countries right now doing litigation. The question is, out of the 22 common law countries in Africa, why are the rest doing litigation? Why is it particular countries that are doing litigation? So a number of factors come into play in that respect. So despite the successes in court, and if you look at many publications around litigation, they're going to be discussing strategies around how to succeed in a court case. So they're going to be discussing how to have the right plaintiff, how to have the right arguments, how to take the case before the right court. Those are the main arguments that come out. This book goes a little bit different from that. It's not about how to organize your case so that you win, but it's about where are you organizing your case and what is in the country where you're organizing your case. So it discusses the broader issues beyond the issues that concern the case itself. So my argument is not that the issue is success. Whether you succeed or fail, my thesis maintains is the same outcome. And this is where it gets interesting. If you've won a case, and if you've lost a case, how can it be the same outcome? So I want us to look at factors that go beyond winning a court case. These are factors that I call them exogenous factors in the book. These are factors that affect how a particular case affects social change in a particular country. So I look at factors like the political climate. I come from Uganda right now, where we vote and our votes don't matter that much. And in such a country where the rule of law and democracy are not deeply entrenched, what do you expect the courts of law to tell the government, and the government does it? So usually in a country like Uganda, when the courts make judgment, they're simply ignored. The government doesn't care, so they can rule. We've had so many judgments, including recently, we had a victory where the court ordered the state to pay 5 million Uganda shillings per individual who failed to access their lawyers during the COVID-19 period. That was 19 LGBT individuals. We won the case, but up now, the people are still asking me, Adrian, where is our money? Because winning the case is a completely different game from getting the money for them. And for the victims, what they want is the compensation that the court gave them. So in such circumstances, what happens is that you won't easily get the change that you want just because the court ordered so. Another issue we should be looking at is the level of judicial independence. The judiciary itself is largely corrupt in many instances, but leaving out the corruption of the judiciary and its own legitimacy, we are looking at judicial independence itself. Can the judiciary actually stand up and make orders that bind the government? In many of our countries, that's not something that is possible. And yet we are running to the judiciary as our savior. Judicial officers themselves are afraid of the state, and we are running to them to save us. In fact, at some point, I argue that we might actually be putting the courts themselves in trouble, just like what happened with the Satang Tribunal in the Southern African region. So maybe when we run to court for them to make such tough decisions, maybe we also put the courts themselves at risk in a country, in an environment that is not very democratic. Another thing is, let us look at the leadership that we have. If you look at countries that have succeeded, even if it's South Africa, there are moments where leaders stood up and said, well, leaders like Nelson Mandela stood up and said, well, I'm going to protect LGBT rights. We have leaders like Museveni in Uganda. We have leaders like Magufuli in Tanzania. We have a number of other leaders who don't even want to hear any talk about LGBT rights. This is the environment in which we are litigating and winning cases and expecting these cases to lead to change. I don't think that's going to happen. I want to move from the political factors to go more to the judicial factors, the legal factors rather. If you look at the aspect of legal pluralism as a concept, we have very many sources of law. In Uganda, for example, you can do anything that you want. The law is not that much respected. If you look at how we drive on our roads, that's when you know that no one respects even the best traffic rules. So courts pass judgment and no one really cares because we're not used to the culture of respecting laws. So whatever the court will say will still remain. All our victories so far have not yielded much. Instead, they have led to what we call backlash and counter-mobilisation. The other side seems to be winning, even if it starts winning in the courts of law. Another factor that you look at is economic empowerment. How economically empowered are LGBT people? There's always this argument that the right to privacy is about the privacy of my bedroom. And I always ask people, if you have no bedroom, how can you talk of privacy of your bedroom? If your bedroom is my living room, how can you say you want privacy in your own bedroom? So many people are poor, they can't sustain themselves, and we're talking about a transformation being caused on their lives by the law. That's something that is very difficult to achieve. So whereas other countries have been able to achieve social transformation, have been able to achieve social change using the courts, my argument is that no, it's not the courts actually. Social transformation happened before the courts actually made their rulings. If you look at the US, with their struggles that they're still going on, decisions have come in as recent as 2016, and I think many are still now going on because they're still having their own struggles around issues of LGBT rights. That's when decisions are coming in, even after decriminalization happened way back in 2003 with Lawrence versus Texas. So basically, the argument I'm making here is that if you're going to make litigation work in our countries, then we need to make our countries work. So activists need to stop relying on court to make changes for them. They need to start creating the changes themselves. Some of the suggestions that I come up with is that we should be able to actively participate in politics. How many LGBT activists are active in politics in our countries in Africa? And if you're not active in politics, then who do we think is going to change the law for us? If we don't want to engage parliament, I've been talking to this group here today and I've been telling them, let's engage parliamentarians. They're like, no, parliamentarians are terrible. I'm like, why are they terrible? They are elected representatives of the people. We need to engage parliamentarians. We need to engage elected officials. We need to gain that kind of legitimacy, show them that, you know what, LGBT persons are exactly like any other person. And that way, if we get our victories through the courts of law, whether through the parliament, through elected officials, that makes a lot of sense. We need to engage our own leadership. The president of Uganda, the parliamentarians of Uganda, the ministers. When we are doing the case on what I call the case of 19, the case of the 19 people were arrested during COVID-19, I realized that my efforts in court were not as successful as my efforts or at what I would call politics. I had to stand before the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs and the Attorney General and demand that we should have a hearing. This should be brought to court. That's what eventually moved things. And eventually the DPP withdrew charges because we actually demanded that the DPP withdrew charges. We engaged them. And I think this is something that we should be looking at. How do we engage elected officials rather than simply relying on courts of law? Courts of law seem to be an easy way, the easy way to go. Courts cannot chase your case away, they'll still hear it. But even if they hear it, what does it mean for you eventually? And also, at what cost does it come? If you go on to court, win cases, and because you've won cases, things like the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda are introduced. That's exactly what happened when we won the first case in 2007, the case of Victor Mkasa. Parliament, whether the Minister of Ethics and Equity at that time proposed that a staff law is going to come because these gays are becoming too much. When South Africa won their case, their marriage is quite a case. Uganda responded by amending the constitution to prohibit same-sex marriages. So what we do in court actually affects what happens this side. So we need to engage and be on the same book. I want to conclude by saying that every country is unique. Litigation might have worked in the US. It might have worked in Canada. It might have worked in South Africa a bit. That doesn't mean litigation is going to work in Africa, in Uganda. It's going to work in Kenya and many other countries. In fact, when the Kenyans had a decrim case in court and the Botswana people had a decrim case in court, I kind of knew that the Kenyans would lose their case and the Botswana people would win because of what was happening in the country in terms of broader levels of democracy, broader engagement with society, broader engagement on LGBT issues. So my advice is let each country deal with strategies that they think work best for their country, rather than thinking that because it worked elsewhere, it's going to work in our countries. And then lastly, we should rely on litigation. We should continue doing litigation. Let us do it while also focusing on other aspects that create lasting change. It won't end tomorrow. We're not going to have this change happening tomorrow. We may want quick fixes. That's not going to happen. No quick fixes. It takes time, and it may take a generation for change to happen. Look at countries that have done that. They took generations to have this change happening. Africa cannot use shortcuts. We have to certainly go through the whole process of having social transformation taking place. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for this insight into your arguments and into the book. Now we turn to the panel. And I want to start by giving the word to Frans Viljoen. Frans, you know Adrian's work really, really well, and also have an unique knowledge of law and society in the African context more broadly. So what would be your comments?
Thank you, Siri. I see that it says the host has stopped my video, so I am not able to...
Are you not able to turn it on?
To turn it on. It says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it, but I'm sure...
It says that you're a co-host, so maybe you can open it. I think we need to get some help.
But I think that's not that terrible.
Yeah, can we see if could everybody else try to turn on their videos to see if we have a similar problem with everyone? No, so the rest.
Oh, that's interesting. Let me just continue, and I apologize.
Yeah. Yes, then you will. No, you're
medicals.
Wonderful, nice to see you.
So I would use the opportunity. Thank you so much, Siri, and for inviting me also. Let me first just celebrate the moment of the launch of this book and the author. I just want to say, Dr. Jjuuko, it had been a privilege to work with you on this project and to see, I think, the dedication that you had, the perseverance, because essentially working full-time and you had many responsibilities while performing also on this. So I never had any sense of resentment. You did that sacrifice with joy and with passion, and I commend you, and I commend you for the process and the outcome. I also, I think on our collective behalf, want to say something about the collaborative nature of the PhD part of the project, which involved Professor Olako Onyango, Joe, who's not here unfortunately, but just to say, I think it was a wonderful trilateral arrangement, right, with Joe and yourself in Uganda and myself involved, and I think it was the best possible synergies that developed between the three of us, and it was part of the success. I also want to say something about the kind of conversion of the thesis into the book, because I think it's also very well done. I think that Nigeria was actually brought into the book when it was really not really focused upon in the thesis, which I think enhances the argument. And I think the focus that we had in the thesis on Nepal and Belize and the outside of Africa countries had been also minimized in the book. So the book has a focus and a kind of enlargement at the same time. And you know, the thesis was a bit of a I don't know, a doorstop. I think the book is also more elegant. So for anyone who wants to look at the thesis, which is on the website of the University of Pretoria, and at the book, it's also a study in how perhaps to convert a book out of a thesis, or get that done. And so for all those reasons, I commend and congratulate you for the process. Now, you sound some skepticism about strategic litigation as ultimately a tool for social change, as perhaps a general proposition. And I think what the thesis did, which I also want to highlight, is to show that the fact that sometimes strategic litigation is unsuccessful or has negative consequences is also not necessarily African, because the examples of Nepal and Belize and even some examples in the United States just reinforce that point, that one has to be contextual in one's approach. And so this idea that somehow, Africa is exceptional in terms of homophobia or in terms of strategic litigation not working out, I think that is refuted by your work collectively. And I think that's an important point. Perhaps looking at the effects of strategic litigation, it may be useful to frame the kind of impact also along two angles, and that is material impact and symbolic impact. And I think that comes from the literature around this topic. If we look at your work also, material impact perhaps can be direct material impact, and it could be indirect material impact. Direct material impact you sketch when, for example, strategic litigation leads to a victory and the court orders, let's say, compensation, or the court orders legislative change, and it actually happens. The indirect material effect is when something happens as a result of the strategic litigation which is not ordered by the court. So the court may have ordered something specific, but there are now effects, for example, policy changes that may come about, something that is concrete and observable, or it may be that a new institution is developed and so on. So yes, if one focuses perhaps just on the direct impact in terms of the court order, there's a different way in which this may play out. But I think perhaps more enduring is the symbolic impact, right? The idea that over time, and you made that point, Adrian, that this is a long-term investment, right? So if we're looking for very short-term gains, we may be disappointed, but it is on the long term that strategic litigation may come with the gains. If we look at the incremental change of public opinion, the effect that it may have just on the way we educate, we talk to each other, the way we frame debates, and the way that also campaigns are conceived of and over the long term. Again, contextual to each country, obviously. In this respect, I also want to just problematize a little bit the idea of, how do we measure this role of strategic litigation in the legal or the societal changes, and that is done very well in the book as well. I think there's always the problem of if we say that something has changed, what do we measure? What is the yardstick? And the yardsticks are often, let's say, Freedom House criteria, or ratings, or it may be statistical data collected by some institution. And these all have their own biases. So the kind of measurement of impact, certainly impact of strategic litigation as well, has its downsides or problems associated with that. What I also think is very interesting is to ask oneself, but are we looking for a direct causal link between the strategic litigation and the societal effect, the change, the legal change. I think if we have a but-for test in mind, but for the strategic litigation, there would not be, or there would be this change. That is a very high test. That is like attributing a kind of a direct link between the two. I think your thesis also does, and your book does, problematize it and show it's often more a question of contribution. It's not attribution, but contribution, right? To use those words. In other words, it's the influence. It is looking at the discernible effect of the strategic litigation, but in the context, certainly, of other societal factors from which the litigation cannot be separated. And it's that kind of weighing of what is the weight of these various factors that make a very problematizes the analysis. But I think you do justice to all of that in your book. Just to say briefly that I think in terms of the subsequent developments, we've seen Botswana, as you said, after your work, Botswana has now seen more strategic litigation, and clearly there's a certain momentum there. The whole question of strategic litigation is also embedded in where do we look for a change in our society? Do we look for that in courts or in the legislature? And we've seen very important changes in Southern Africa in this domain, Angola, Mozambique, not happening through strategic litigation, but through the legislature. So I think that's an interesting polarity to also investigate. It's not an investment in strategic litigation and the court route that is what is called for in any particular society. Let me just make one obvious point about the kind of elephant in the room. Since we talk about common law Africa, what I think someone else clearly needs to investigate is also, well, what about Francophone civil law Africa? Clearly, there seems to be very, very little strategic litigation that is happening in that region of our continent. And I think some of the factors would be that, it's basically a legal culture issue, that for the Francophone lawyer, it's more about doctrine and not experience that informs legal evolution. So strategic litigation is not foregrounded in that. We also have the problem in terms of standing in the Francophone countries, not even able to bring a case beyond the direct victim in terms of, for example, actio popularis. And then clearly also the structure of judicial review, where it is very difficult in Francophone countries mostly to even challenge legislation for its incompatibility with the constitution, and that is an impediment. So I think, Adrian, you've awoken many new avenues for further research and for further thinking, and that's perhaps one of the greatest things that a book or a thesis can accomplish. So congratulations once again, and thank you for also having me on the panel.
Thank you, Frans. This was excellent comments and a very good start to the panel discussion. But we have more commentators, so we'll move to Satang, who will. I mean, you also know Adrian's work well and have a slightly different perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Siri. And to join Frans and everybody else to say congratulations, Adrian. I mean, I think we all knew that when Adrian was doing his PhD, he made the rest of us look bad. So, but yeah. Anyway, just to say, we got to, both the thesis as well as what culminated into the book itself. I think for me personally, both as a scholar, as an activist, I found it very insightful. And this is despite the fact that even if I think one of the utility of the book is that even if you don't work on with LGBT persons or on that issue, that the exploration of the topic itself, that is the use of strategic litigation for social change, can be useful for marginalized groups, other marginalized groups and vulnerable groups. So say women's rights and sexual and reproductive rights and so forth. So the book itself goes beyond just the issue that has been addressed, that is with regard to the protections for LGBT persons. So I actually find it very delightful. And I think for me, especially and I just say something about methodology and method, I think I find it interesting because I think especially within the academic sphere and within the, especially when you're doing a PhD, an LLD, a doctoral degree in law, there is the difficulty of trying to balance the blend of theory and practice, because we're usually very doctrinal. So this book and the thesis itself is quite different in the sense that it really is a blend of theory and practice, like blending both Adrian as the scholar, Adrian as the activist, Adrian as the academic into, culmination of what his experience have been over the past years, as well as drawing the fine line between being an activist and scholar. So in terms of methodology, I really found the book interesting, because I do believe that we need to do more action research and do research that has more utility, in a sense, in terms of the issues that we deal with, in terms of the work that we do in trying to enhance protections for marginalized groups and vulnerable groups. I think in general, I mean, just to add on Frans and everybody's comment about the book itself, I think for me, I see it as a very powerful critique of the use of strategic litigation for social change. I mean, as Adrian rightly said, we do recognize the utility of using strategic litigation. It's useful for raising awareness, for trying to make change and advocating for change. But it's also useful that, as Adrian actually did in the book, in terms of exploring what might be the factors that might, result to the effective utility of the outcomes of cases, and generally the use of strategic litigation. Because as he rightly noted in his presentation, as well as in the book, that judicial wins do not necessarily translate into political outcome, especially when governments do not implement the outcomes of the court rulings, especially within their sort of like the political system that we find ourselves in. As he rightly said, in several of our countries, the political system is very authoritarian. So even despite the fact that you might have a win, for instance, we've seen this in the case of Gambia, for example, during Jammeh's presidency, you win a case, you go out, they rearrest you. So, I mean, even though the ruling was in your favor. So really, in terms of just exploring what the external factors are, not necessarily the method itself in terms of the strategy litigation, I think it's useful. But I think for me, I mean, I'm not the expert in this case. Adrian is, and everybody else. Well, I'm just here, I guess. But I think for me, I'm particularly interested in questions that Adrian raised in his book, questions in terms of institutional power and resources. I think this is important, especially in terms of exploring what types of resources are available for citizens to file such actions. I know that, as he rightly said, in certain countries, there is actually a rise of strategic litigation, and it might be because, you have more lawyers probably interested in the issue of strategic litigation. But we do know that to undertake strategic litigation, public interest litigation, you do need resources. And in most cases, in most of our African countries, this is a problem for citizens. For instance, in the Gambia, where there is hardly any public interest litigation. And it's not just about, about standing and other issues, but it's also about resources as well. So in terms of institutional power, because I think power is important, it's an important element in terms of, executing strategic litigation. So what type of resources are available for citizens? But I think, especially for the book itself, I think the most important question around power and institutional power will be what types of legal and institutional powers do courts have to compel government implementation. And I think that really goes to the crux of his book in terms of, just what we said, you can have a really good ruling, but then it's not implemented by government, and there is no really any type of institutional structure to compel government to actually implement those rulings as well. And just generally, just another thing that I got out of the book itself is that, strategic litigation, as Adrian mentioned, should just not focus on the individual cases. So really not just thinking around methods, I guess, of whether to use strategic litigation or not, and what might be the angles that you might use in courts and so forth. But it's also an analysis of the potential outcome of the legal decision. And I think that is very much related to the potential backlash and whether, even a court ruling in your favor will push for more protections, or rather it will, as he rightly illustrated in his book, that in many instances as well, you had court rulings that actually had a backlash on the protection of LGBT persons and so forth. So in terms of really exploring what might be the potential outcome of this. And just to conclude and to say that I think for me, the main idea out of Adrian's book is that we need to be strategic about strategic litigation. in a sense. Well, that's a nice quote, Adrian. So you should take that. And anyway, no, but I'll stop here, and I'm happy to be part of the discussion. And thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Satang. Very good points. And I just want to add that I think we were all just super surprised when Adrian had just started his PhD and then he was done. I think it's the quickest PhD I've ever sort of watched happen. And it's, I think it took about 2 years besides work. And I think the rest of us don't really know how that can happen. But also I want to say that it was very interesting when you reworked the thesis into a book, both that it was quick, but also that you were so determined that it had to be an African press, so it's Daria Press, and that you wanted it to be a tool for local activists and scholars. And I think that is something that I also wanted to be out there, because I think it's a very commendable approach. And someone else who really makes writings also for the local context and a very prolific writer is the next commentator, Ayodele Sogunro. And Ayo, you're also, like Satang, colleague of Adrian. And you've worked very closely on the topic as well.
Thank you very much, Siri, and to all the other great points that have been made. I do not want to turn this into some kind of hagiography for Adrian, but I do not think I may have very soon another public opportunity to, just express some kind of gratitude for what Adrian is doing, not just for the community and, for society in general, but for actually those of us who are also in the academia. When I started my LLM in 2017, Adrian had just finished editing the Protection of Sexual Minorities in Africa book. And I practically relied on that book as my constant referencing source for my LLM dissertation. And then as I was about to start my PhD in 2018, Adrian was just also finishing again his PhD thesis. I'm like, oh, thank you, Adrian. Just keep dropping these very good resource materials for me to kind of build up my own work onto. And so, it's been very helpful, and I cannot overestimate the importance that his contribution has provided for the academic community. And I'm sure generations of people coming behind us would also confirm this. But yes, on some of the points that I was going to make, I just realized that it seems that both Professor Viljoen and Satang have already kind of captured those points, and I do not want to belabor the points, but they are still such very important points that I think I should mention them again, but from this different context, or again from the Nigerian context, which I am most familiar. What Adrian is saying, this whole idea of trying to, critique an approach to advocacy, but without also turning it off or saying it is useless. It's such a fine line to walk. And courtesy of the fact that I've had the opportunity to read both this thesis and also taking a look at the book too, I can see how he has managed to walk through that fine line without making it seem that strategic litigation is useless, but without also making it seem like it's some kind of magic bullet that would cure every single thing, which is where my own research comes in, because my own research has been to try and focus on the fact that, look, we live in context, for most of us in Africa, especially common law Africa, where we have repressive laws as colonial legacy, where it is not just those laws that are repressive, but it is also the entire socio-political system that is problematic. Those laws themselves are a consequence of the kind of system that colonialism tried to create. And so it is not just enough to challenge those laws. We must also challenge the systems that support those laws. And part of the problem is this: the people who run our countries right now understand the fact that the only way in which they can validly agree that these laws are problematic will include a re-examination of their own claim to legitimacy under systems that were embedded by their own predecessors and which they had validated through years of, just building on those systems. And so they are not just homophobic in the context of deep cultural values. They are homophobic from a political perspective. So it's more of political homophobia than religious or cultural. It is homophobia that is derived from the need to control society, from power. And so it brings two things up, which again, other people have mentioned. One is the issue of democracy, and two is the issue of socioeconomic equality. In the absence of an effective democratic system, where you have dysfunctional legal systems, where there is no rule of law, where there is no independence of the judiciary, where there is no equality before the law, what essentially happens is that courts cease to be avenues for the protection of rights, but really become tools of oppressive power, which essentially forces marginalized communities to distrust the use of courts. In that instance, the judicial systems tend to be more, punitive in the way they exist, especially when it comes to marginalized communities, rather than actually protective. And so people want to avoid these spaces. They don't believe that litigation and judicial systems would help them in any way, and they have empirical and historical reasons to say this. On the other hand, and that's what I think is happening in Nigeria, if we can get to a point where some people can, so to say, resist power with power, they can begin to use courts not really as avenues like Adrian has highlighted, as avenues for winning cases, but as narrative platforms for changing social attitudes. We are going to court not because we really want to win or because we think this would become something that the government will implement, but because you want to use those same tools of oppression to change social understanding of the issues. And that then brings up the second point, which is socioeconomic power. Adrian notes in his book that, look, one of the reasons why the marginalization of LGBT people continues is their failure to economically support themselves. So without economic empowerment, Adrian argues that even if all cases were won, people will not be empowered enough to take advantage of the resulting benefits. And that, in a sense, is what we see in places like South Africa, where even though there are legal and constitutional norms protecting marginalized communities, including LGBTIQ communities, there is still a classist and socioeconomic problem that prevents the poorest people, or that prevents women who are Black and who are lesbian, or that prevents people with disabilities who do not have access to other resources from enjoying the full protection of these legal norms. And so then, it is not enough again to win the legal battle. We must also win the socioeconomic battles. The question then is, which one comes before? Is it the socioeconomic power that would allow us to win the legal battle, or do we need to change the law first to empower people socioeconomically, and then we will then change social attitudes? I think it's going to be a continuous process. One will inform the other, which would inform the other. And there have been studies that show that there's a continuous correlation between socioeconomic power and equality, and of course, social attitudes towards LGBTQ plus people. So those are the 2 points I really wanted to highlight, and I think other people have also mentioned it. But yes, congratulations, Adrian, and thank you for having me here, and hopefully we'll see many more of this in coming years.
So thanks a lot, Ayo. Very important points. Very, very interesting. And then last, but certainly not least, we'll jump over the ocean and go to the US. Tom Keck. Tom, you've studied this and similar processes in the US. You know the literature really, really well. How does this analysis fit with the picture that you see?
Siri, thanks so much. And let me just join everyone else in congratulating Adrian on the book. It's amazing to see it in print. And I stayed up late last night reading it myself and very much enjoyed it and learned so much. And I've been very much enjoying the conversation so far here today. So for those who've read the book, or even if you haven't read the book, I think you can kind of get this sense already just from the conversation here today. You know, Adrian, in the book, Adrian expresses really kind of a deep ambivalence about strategic litigation, right? So like on the one hand, one of the principal themes of the book, as with so much of the literature on strategic litigation, right, is that there's this really striking gap between the law on the books and the law on the ground, right? So, I mean, it was remarkable to me. I'm not an Africa expert, right? And so it was remarkable to me that to read that Adrian had identified 30 instances of strategic litigation in these 5 countries and that 20 of them had been successful in court. It's skewed a little bit by the South African numbers, but still that was a remarkable record of courtroom success to me. But then the book says very clearly, right, these courtroom victories have not translated into sweeping changes on the ground for the lives of LGBT persons. So on the one hand, right, there's as with other studies of strategic litigation, right, there's a really clear-eyed recognition that winning in court does not necessarily produce the kinds of changes that we're seeking. On the other hand, the book ends with a pretty strikingly clear endorsement of strategic litigation, at least on my reading, right? I mean, the whole last chapter is like a how-to guide for like how to do it better. And one note I wrote down is that one of the recommendations was strategic lawsuits should be filed as continuously as possible, right? The more of it, the better, to help sort of keep up a constant sort of pressure on the courts to recognize these ongoing rights violations, right? So that's kind of a deep ambivalence there, right? Well, what do we make of this? And so what I took away from it, and my my frame of reference is mostly U.S. based strategic litigation campaigns, including on LGBT rights. Is that, so I really got from the book. So this dovetails, I think, with Satang's comment about, okay, so one lesson is that we need to be more strategic about strategic litigation, right? And so in the US literature, there's sometimes a tension on what some scholars have called litigation as part of a multi-dimensional advocacy campaign, that sort of thing, right? So that sophisticated cause lawyering with clear-eyed goals, right? Not unrealistic goals about like a court decision is going to change the world, right? But with clear-eyed and realistic goals and with sophisticated, careful, collective decision-making about when and where to litigate and what issues to highlight and when and where to wait for further legislative or public opinion progress first, right? All of those questions about the proper sequence and timing of litigation. When cause lawyering is situated within that kind of sophisticated multidimensional advocacy, it really does have quite a lot of benefits, right? Or at least potential benefits, right? And so the how-to chapter at the end is partly like how to do better rather than worse cause lawyering, right? And so so I hope there's a broad audience for that chapter in Africa and elsewhere, and I hope lots of advocates learn from it. And from the perspective of the sort of US-based literature, what I found so striking about it is that I'm sure there's plenty of bad cause lawyering in Africa, just as there's plenty of bad cause lawyering in the United States. I don't mean to question that, but Adrian, you yourself are a cause lawyer in Africa who are clearly doing, I think, good, right? Clearly doing what you think is using the tools in a sophisticated way, being strategic about our strategic litigation in a way that's carefully situated in a broader toolkit of activist strategies. And I'm sure you're not the only one, right? And it's certainly true in the US as well. It is certainly true in the marriage equality story in the US, where, while the political context was never as foreboding as it is in contemporary Uganda, right? The political context for marriage equality in, like, say 30 years ago in the United States was really quite bad, right? There was, I'm going to say, not a single elected office holder anywhere in the country who was publicly advocating for marriage equality. So the prospects for successful litigation seemed like zero, but the prospects for successful legislative change also seemed like zero. And so in a kind of really negative, in the face of a really negative political and legal opportunity structure, sophisticated cause lawyering can play an important role in kind of chipping away at some aspects of the negative opportunity structure and helping to clear some space for other forms of advocacy to get up and running, even if it's just a matter of getting activists out of jail, right? That sometimes requires cause lawyering, right? And so the fact that I know for sure in the US that there are some cause lawyers who are pretty sophisticated about using the tools in a sophisticated manner, and they don't just think litigation is going to change the world by itself. And the fact that your book shows me that there are some cause lawyers in common law Africa who are similarly sophisticated. For me, one takeaway from this that I want to just end on is, it really gives the lie to the claims that you sometimes read about, advocates being, I don't know, like hypnotized by the myth of rights, right? I mean, again, I'm sure somewhere there are some lawyers that happens to, but there is so much sophisticated cause lawyering in the world where the people filing these lawsuits, right, do not believe, they clearly do not believe that a victory in court is going to automatically change the world. And yet they are still looking at the landscape in front of them, looking at the legal and political opportunity structures, looking at the available options on the table, and concluding that litigation has to be part of this toolkit. And if we don't nurture lawyers and legal rights organizations and funding sources for litigation, then the movement is going to be set back, right? So to take the anti-homosexual bill in Uganda, right? I mean, it wasn't just strategic litigation that got that bill blocked, right? I mean, international pressure played a role and the like, as you show, but the lawsuit created a vehicle by which the government could say, okay, now we've got to get rid of this bill now because we're in trouble at the UN, right? And the lawsuit was the vehicle that they could get rid of it by still saving face, right? They didn't repeal it themselves. And so that kind of thing, the lawsuit didn't change everything by itself, but the lawsuit was an important component in the broader multidimensional advocacy campaign. And one thing I just really loved about the book is sort of the fact that you were sort of documenting these kind of dynamics as a scholar, but that I also always had in the back of my head that, you were actually doing these things, right, yourself, really gave me a kind of rich understanding of what cause lawyering looks like in common law Africa right now. And so I really appreciated that.
Thank you so much, Tom. So I think, I love the end of it, that this is some kind of do-it-yourself manual as well. So Adrian, you have had a lot of good feedback, a lot of good comments. I want to read a couple of questions that came in from the audience as well before I give the word back to you. And I also want to encourage everyone who wants to ask questions to do so. And then I also would like all the panelists to turn on the camera so that we can see everyone for the last part. So you have one question or comment from Francis Xavier, who says, with the unfavorable environment in Uganda, how does Dr. Adrian intend to use this book to advocate for gender equality amongst others, especially for the LGBTI rights? I think this book is powerful. So that is it's a compliment, but also a question and a challenge. Thuruna Naidu is asking, could Professor Frans or Dr. Adrian comment on the use of the court as an advocacy tool, such as the example of the equality court system in South Africa, and how best marginalized communities can take advantage of such platforms, sort of courts as advocacy tools, which is of course very relevant. And then the last question for now is from Indy Roseman, who says, congrats, Adrian, on the book and great panel. Props to you all. My question has to do with the counter-mobilisation and cause lawyering that we see in the US and is likely being exported. We see litigation to recognize rights to religious expression as the vehicle to continue discrimination against LGBT communities and women's rights. What are your thoughts about this? So this goes to the panel. Will it be successful? Does that expose the political nature of judicial rulings? And I think many of these questions go to the panel, so we'll take a round on them. And the last question is, can I get a copy of the book, Dr. Adrian? That's from Mapako Williams. So I think the books can be ordered from Daria Press, and the soft copies can be downloaded from the LawTransform website. Okay, Adrian, I will give the word back to you, and then we'll take a round with the panel and keep the questions coming.
Thank you so much, Siri, and thank you so much, panelists and people who have asked questions. I think it's a good feeling when people have positive feedback about your book. It's the first book I'm launching, so it's kind of a good feeling for people to give positive comments about that. I'll just respond to a few of the comments that have been made. And I'm going to start with Frans. I thank you. First of all, this is our project. We jointly worked on it, certainly working on the PhD, as you mentioned, with my two supervisors himself and Professor Lokonyango. And then it turned out the way it is. And of course, Siri for the book, when I came and settled in Bergen for about a month, at some point, I decided that if I leave Bergen, this book must be complete. Thank you so much for that. Frans, you mentioned Gabon, you mentioned Angola and Mozambique. I have a few issues around Mozambique and Angola processes. I have a feeling that, first of all, I've not studied them. I would admit that I haven't studied them in details, but I have a feeling that the process is kind of not activists engage in parliament and making parliament change the law, but rather for some reason, parliament decided to change the law for whatever reason they gave. Now, why I find that problematic is parliament that has done this, yes, but who told them? As in, where's the activism? Where are the people? What does the community think? If you look at Angola, if you think at Mozambique, for example, up to now, I think Lambda is not yet registered, right? They can get rid of these laws, but they still refuse to register people. They refuse to put in place protections. That reminds me of countries like Rwanda, countries that have never criminalized homosexuality, DRC. They don't faring better than countries that have criminalized. You know, just because they don't criminalize doesn't mean they don't oppress. In fact, in certain circumstances, you don't even get to talk at all because the law seems to be okay and you have even no argument to make. I tested this a little bit in Uganda when we had the Homosexuality Act nullified. Many of our partners outside Uganda were like, okay, Uganda, you no longer even need to do activism. You guys are okay. There's not a Homosexuality Act. I'm like, hey guys, there has always been the penal code. There have always been challenges beyond the law. Let us look beyond the law and look at actually what happens in practice. So that's my little problem with Angola and Mozambique processes. I didn't really fully understand how they came about, but they need to be studied a little bit more. What does it actually mean? Does it actually mean social change on the ground or just getting rid of the law and you go home? And I have a feeling Mozambique, Angola are a little bit more like Uganda and Nigeria, where the law says something different, we also do something a little bit different. And Satang, I like the idea about this book going beyond LGBT. Actually, when I kept writing, I actually felt I could get rid of the word LGBT and keep it as litigation and the struggle for marginalized groups, generally speaking, because I think it's truly applicable to all other groups. If you come to think of it, for women, for example, for sex workers, and many other groups, there's that resistance that comes in for the population because these are unpopular groups. And I think it would as well apply to many of those groups. And institutional power. Who actually speaks truth to power? Who questions the government in our countries? Can the courts play that role? Can the electorate Like I told you, in Uganda, we vote, but we don't seem to get the people we vote for. Can the electorate, can the courts, can they actually make the government do what we want to do? Who does the government of Uganda answer to? In fact, I think foreigners in my country are more respected than citizens. That seems to be a truism. We may speak out as Ugandans, but no one seems to care. Until foreigners speak out, that's when they listen. So some of these things bother you and you're like, okay, what does it actually mean? And Ayo, everyone should read Ayo's book, Everything Nigeria is Going to Kill You. It's a very interesting book. When I was reading it, Ayo, I thought I was reading about Uganda. You know, exactly the same circumstances. And that's why I added Nigeria to the countries I studied later on for the book, because Nigeria seemed to be, to me, to be another Uganda. And not surprisingly, most of the things happening in Uganda are also happening in Nigeria, because our setup seems to be almost the same, from colonialism, from the British, the way we divided ourselves, the way the dictatorships and the coup d'etats, we still continue to follow the same systems, and no wonder we are actually quite similar. You brought the issue of using courts as narrative platforms, and I think someone asked about it before. How can you continue going to court? Even Tom mentioned it. How do you continue going to court? Yet there are challenges with litigation, and that's the answer. The answer is about narrative platforms. When you push these systems of oppression, you go in there and make them do the right thing, something gives, something works out eventually. So we can't abandon them, because for some reason, the elites tend to use them as the arenas of discussion and conversation. So you cannot ignore them. Of course, not forgetting the fact that, yes, when you engage with the courts of law, you are largely not engaging with the majority of the people who are most affected by these laws. But for me, that's powerful. Let us use them, let us turn them into tools that we can use against their own users. Tom, it's quite interesting having one of my main citations being a commenter on the book. You are right here in the book, cited every other time about, especially about your backlash thesis. I liked it when I read it, and it's good that you're commenting about it. And I read the backlash. I wouldn't have termed it as such if it wasn't for your writings. I was seeing it completely in a different light. But also for me, the influence of countries like the US on litigation in Africa is enormous. When I mentioned that in the past 20 years, in the past 10 years, we are doing out of litigation, I'm also basically looking at the period when the US has been engaged in its own litigation, and why people in America believe that what they are doing in America can be replicated in Uganda, regardless of the circumstances in Uganda. And most of the cases that we do are supported and sponsored and funded by Americans and many other Western groups. So because the funding is available, maybe that's why we also do litigation. We may not be doing litigation because we love doing litigation. We may be doing it because someone believes somewhere else that this can work for Africa. That's why this book is written for Africans, to understand that, yes, you may have the money from somewhere to do this litigation. Can't you do this litigation the way you ought to do it as an African? Can't you use your mechanism? The courts in the US are not the same as the courts in Africa. The US Supreme Court says something, everyone follows, including Trump. The Supreme Court of Uganda says something, Museveni calls them chicken, only worth of deciding chicken thief cases. Completely different. And he may do all sorts of things to the court, and the court is afraid of doing certain things because the president there might be backlash to them. So different systems, and also the way the way the law is respected in the US, the way the law is respected in Uganda is completely different. So I loved the US. When I was reading it, the US for me looked like South Africa a bit. Sounded a little bit like, in certain cases, Uganda, Botswana, and Kenya, in some respects, the battles, the struggles, the cultural fights are going on in the US, and a good study of why the US is not necessarily also not using legislation, but rather using litigation. You had that what happened in California with Proposition 8 in California, where a court says something different, then something is overturned by legislatures. It's a very good conversation that's happening in the US, which is something we can learn a lot from as Ugandans and as activists. You mentioned something, you kept mentioning the word lawyers. I'm a little bit anti-lawyer these days. I'm a lawyer myself, but lawyers taking on movement cases and owning them is an issue in litigation in Africa. Lawyers ought to be behind the scenes. Yes, they're the ones who argue these cases in court, but these are not their cases. Lawyers won't be beaten up tomorrow. Lawyers are likely to be a little bit more free than actual LGBT people who are facing the struggles every single day. And for me, I want to put the movement right in front. That's what we've been trying to do with activism and advocacy in Uganda, and even litigation in Uganda. We put the faces, we put the people who are affected on the front line, and the lawyers have to take instructions from the clients, and even up to arguments. Our approach in Uganda was, we even edit, we even approve the arguments the lawyers make in court. You don't just wake up in the morning and go to court and argue our case. We vet the case in the legal committee of the coalition, and we tell you, don't make that argument, make this one. One thing that was interesting was the argument on costs. The lawyers usually wanted to ask for costs because I think costs somehow go to the lawyers. We told them, if you're going to do these cases for Ugandan LGBT community, don't ask for costs, and make it clear that we're not asking for costs, so that we're also not condemned in costs. So that way you control the lawyers, and they're running away with the litigation agenda and doing things on their own because they are cause lawyering. So that's what I would like to say basically about the comments. Thank you so much for the feedback.
Thank you, Adrian. Very, very many good points. And I think in particular, the point about sort of the relationship between the lawyers and the clients are super important. And also sort of the agency of funders in the whole picture. And I think we only have time for a last round for everyone to say a few words at the end, but I will also read one more comment that came from the audience saying that I believe that the book is a powerful tool for advocacy in itself and for different activists to learn about the dynamics of strategic litigation in different countries. But I think that is, I mean, it also goes to the point of sort of the importance of narratives and the importance of persuasion. So I just wanted to bring that in. I think we'll, when we go for the last set of reflections and comments, we'll start at the end. So I'll let Tom go first, and then Ayo, Satang, and Frans at the end.
Thanks. So just very briefly, so yeah, Adrian, I really appreciate that point you make about the role of U.S. and Western funding in, on the one hand, supporting human rights advocacy in Africa, but on the other hand, sort of potentially directing some of it in ways that are not well thought out. And so, you know, I wanted to make the point that both in the U.S. and in Africa, there's pretty sophisticated cause lawyers doing the things that you're recommending. Mm-hmm. But I take your point that it is also true that there are funders and others who have a less sophisticated understanding of the proper role of cause lawyering and are sometimes trying to drive it in less helpful directions. And then just the last thing I'll say is to just sort of flag Mindy's comment in the chat, because I'm curious if other folks on the panel have thoughts about this. In the US, I think it is clearly a danger, like partly given the partisan capture of our apex court, there is a clear current danger that new and expansive conceptions of religious freedom or quote unquote religious freedom are going to be used to limit further progress on LGBT rights and women's rights. And I'm curious to hear from the panelists if similar dynamics are playing out in Africa.
I think I'm going next now. Okay, so Adrian, thank you again for putting my book out there. I encourage everyone to buy it. It's on Amazon. But yes, more serious issues. This has been quite really enlightening, and I want to piggyback a little on the aspect of lawyers and social movements. I remember a conversation I had with Prof. Viljoen back in 2015 when we had our first Lawfare forum in South Africa. And I was hearing all these things from all these other lawyers at the table about what they were doing in their countries for the movement. And I turned to Prof, and you may not recall this conversation, and I said, it's really curious that in Nigeria, we do not have lawyers leading any of this. Like, it's just kind of like social workers doing all of this work. So they just hire, some specific lawyers for things like bailing people who have been arrested arbitrarily, but not really as part of the movement. And I don't really recall now exactly, but Frans was like, okay, that's actually quite interesting. That so are there no lawyers leading this in Nigeria? Like, yeah, like it's kind of just a social worker led movement. Fast forward about 5 years now, and lawyers are leading it in Nigeria. Even the organization I was working for then, whose executive director was not a lawyer, the organization is now headed by a lawyer. And it's almost like lawyers are right all over the scene in Nigeria. And so there is that danger that really when lawyers get on the scene, they can begin to take on. I myself, I'm also a lawyer, of course, and I've kind of also grown with the movement and have a much more influential role now also than probably back then also. So there's always that constant scene that we lawyers need to really check ourselves and not become the voice of the communities as opposed to, being service providers to the community. But yes, otherwise, I don't think I have any extra points I want to make, and I thank everybody again, and for Adrian and Siri and the people at Center for Law and Social Transformation for holding this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayo. Satang?
Yes. I just wanted to say, just before I conclude, Tom's comment related to Mindy's comment about the utilization of the same sort of strategies that pro-SRR movements use, and now that is used by the opposition. I was just recently doing a mapping of strategies taken by the opposition, SRR opposition in South Africa, and it's quite interesting how the utilization of strategic litigation, as well as just generally legal advocacy around, clawbacking on already existing sexual and reproductive rights protections and measures are quite interesting. And I think it's also like a warning to the pro-SRR movement, because sometimes it's like constantly, they need to be consistently aware of what sort of strategies the opposition can take and just being ready. I think that was really one of the outcomes of the mapping exercise. But I think just drawing it back and just concluding, I think, one takeaway from Adrian's book, and I think just to connect it to Susan, I know, Susan, you talked about Audre Lorde's powerful quote about using the master's tool will not dismantle the master's house. I mean, I totally agree, but I think out of Adrian's book also is that, whilst, we might not achieve our ultimate goal, it's still, strategic litigation is still a useful tool. And I think one takeaway from the book is that, and I think that has been sort of like a consistent criticism in terms of the utilization of strategies from the global north used within the global south. I think it's in terms of that whatever strategies you use, at the end of the day, it needs to be contextualized in the local context that you find yourself, whilst adhering to all the broader context and factors that might be useful in terms of pushing for your ultimate agenda. But I think in the end, I want to really recommend Adrian's book. I think I think a good takeaway is that it's not only available by just buying, that it's open source. I think this is important because I do believe, as I think Siri mentioned before, that this book is not just for lawyers because it's about strategic litigation. It's also for grassroots activists. So for grassroots activists to be able to access it means it needs to be open source. And I'm happy that it's open source, and it's really a roadmap for people that are interested in taking important human rights cases, not just on LGB, but I think generally for marginalized groups and pushing for better protection. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Satang. Before I give the last word to Frans, I just want to say to all of those who sent in the questions to the chat a bit late that Adrian will get them all, and we really appreciate it. And as you noted from Satang, the panelists have been able to read them as well. But our time is very soon up, so the last word to Frans Viljoen.
Thank you once again. And there are so many comments one can make and issues to further ponder. But let me just take the issue, Adrian, of the Parliament vis-a-vis perhaps the judiciary as a route for reform. And you are certainly right that in Angola and Mozambique, we had kind of elite-driven process of legal reform, and also in Gabon, I think you mentioned very briefly. So I think that can leave us with cynicism, but it also certainly takes a certain weight off those who are living in those communities. It creates some kind of an opening, isn't it? So in terms of educational possibilities, possibilities for civil society to mobilize, those are somehow, I think, enhanced. The problem is that there are weak civil society mobilization in those countries, and that really is the key, is to get entry points and make things happen through that route. I mean, I'm reminded that South Africa also had a very elite-driven constitutional reform process, and the changes in the constitution would probably just have stayed constitutional changes and not have filtered down to the actual communities if it hadn't been for the mobilization through civil society and strategic litigation. So South Africa, to some extent, is an example of how that elite change ultimately becomes something that's useful and mobilized through strategic litigation and many other processes. So I know it's a very optimistic picture, and it maybe negates how stifled civil society is at the moment in these societies. But I think it is something that collectively we should all explore as an entry point that could be mobilized. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'll also just once again say, Adrian, congratulations, and continue the excellent work, and also to Siri and everyone involved. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you